All right, back to this theme that we mentioned just before our break, all-important theme. Again, unfortunately, it's even one that we have to cover, but in this day, in this age, this time in which we're living and ministering, we do. So here are some steps that I would highly recommend that should be taken to protect your young people. To protect your young people. Let me just start out by saying several years ago, actually it was quite a few years ago, we had a young man who was in the youth ministry. He was maybe 17, maybe 18 years old. And I know that this sounds rather horrific, but I suppose nothing is too shocking or surprising in this age in which we live. But we found out, it was brought to my attention, that he had sexually molested his half-sister. And, I was quite overwhelmed, and the responsibility seemed to fall to me to have to seek out this individual and confront him with these facts. His mother didn't even want to confront it, did not want to even deal with it. It was actually his father, his stepdad, that came to me and in tears begged me to do something before things got even worse than they were. And so we did confront him, and he was expelled. And then, you know what happened? About a year later, after he finished school, apparently he did finish school. I can't remember all of the details, but anyhow, he moved to another state. And when I knew that he was moving to another state, and no doubt he would have contact with another youth ministry in that state, and I happened to know who the youth pastor was that was ministering there, and I called him up, and and see, this is the sensitive material and the sensitive nature of the material that we have to deal with, without going into all of the details, but giving this youth pastor a heads up. You are taking somebody into your youth ministry potentially who could be prosecuted and found guilty of some bad things. And, you're just trying to use language without, sounding like you're passing on over the telephone and sharing an evil report. Well, you know how it was received by the other party? The other party said, I don't want to hear this. This is negative. There's no evidence. And I said, excuse me. I said, I'm just telling you, I want to give you a heads up. I said, you need to know this. Okay, because we're not certain that this person has gotten any, professional help. We don't know that this person has got any counseling. We think that this person is just running from this state to another state because he doesn't want to face the reality of what he's done. And he said, well, don't want to hear it. Appreciate the call, but I don't want to hear it. I don't want to receive any of it. Please. He stopped me, and I said, listen. I said, that's fine. That's your choice. I said, but just so that you know, I tried to call you. I wanted to warn you. And that was that. And wouldn't you know it, within 6 months, I got a phone call from him. And he was in tears. Now, to quote him, he said, if I ever find this young man, he says, these were his words, he says, I will beat him to death with a baseball bat. Because what he did is that he went after young girls in that youth ministry. And, very damaging results. And he apologized. He said, I just want you to know how sorry I am. He said, I was a fool. I should have listened to you. And I realize now that you weren't spreading gossip. This wasn't an evil report. It wasn't knowing somebody after the flesh. You're trying to protect our kids by giving me a heads up about really someone who was coming in close proximity to our youth ministry. And, it was kind of sad that it wasn't received. Now, today, of course, this was many, many years ago. Today, you can just do some simple cross-checking with the authorities, whether on a local, state, or federal level, and you can find out, based upon a person's background, whether or not they have any kind of criminal activity or any kind of criminal history, especially in relationship to young people. But back then, that didn't exist. This was probably 20 to 25 years ago. So, again, the responsibility is ours. So, if you're in charge of the youth ministry, and if you're in charge and responsible for those that are working under you in that youth ministry that have direct contact with young people, that ultimately you must answer for, then you need to know who's working with them. You need to know. And so I would, again, recommend the following steps. Number one, require a written application. If they're going to work with young people, require a written application. I'm very happy to be able to tell you and to inform you that in our ministry here at the Greater Grace World Outreach in Baltimore, you cannot work with young people without filling out a written application and submitting to a background check for any kind of criminal activity. And if there is criminal activity and something warrants that you should not be working with young people, it's just, nothing personal, it just won't happen. You won't be working with young people. That's not to suggest that somebody who has a criminal background, of which I am one, that you can't work with young people. I mean, my criminal background happened BC, before Christ. And it is, and it wasn't anything of a nature that would render me, insufficient to work with young people. It didn't have anything to do with that. It was just stupid, idiotic decisions that got me in a lot of trouble. I didn't serve any prison time, by the way. I want to make that clear. I was just arrested for minor infractions. But that's as much as I'm going to tell you, okay? You want to know more about it, see me later. But the point is, if they do, some people can come to us, they might, who knows, they might have robbed a bank, but then afterwards, while serving prison time, they might have received Christ as their Savior. They come out of prison, they find a local church, and there they are. That's all in the past. That's all been buried. That's all under the blood. And they've got a brand new beginning and a brand new person. And it's a brand new life. That's not what we're talking about here, okay? Now, if somebody, I would suggest somebody has robbed a bank, and maybe they robbed several banks, and then they got saved, and they came to your church, and they asked if they could have a position in the finance department. That's when you might want to say, maybe not. You see? I hope you pick up the wisdom and that kind of thinking, that train of thought. I mean, that just makes sense, right? I mean, that would make sense to me, I don't want to put you in a realm that you might be tempted in. Right? It's kind of like, just ask yourself this question when you take your church offerings. Who's collecting all the money? Does he have a history of stealing? If he does, it'll be like, here's the money. Small offering today. I mean, it just makes sense, right? That you'd want to be wise when putting people in those kinds of positions. Well, we're talking about the same thing with young people. Obviously, that application includes a question about any kind of abusive activity in their background. Yes?
What if you had a situation like that, and someone came to you and said, I did have a history with this, but then God saved me, hasn't been an issue, or, he's totally delivered me, would you still be like,
Are you talking about abuse with young people?
Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, what if you did have somebody that came to you and this was part of their past, and now they come to you and this was something maybe before they were believers. Still then, I think that you have to you've got to take a good, hard, long look at it. And if you're not convinced personally that this is the right decision for you to make, then you seek out the counsel of others in leadership. Okay? You go to the pastor, you go to someone who may be in charge of these kinds of affairs in your local assembly. You might even want to check with state laws and find out what the law has to say about somebody with that kind of a background. Could be that state law prohibits them, which would kind of clear it all up and take you right out of the loop so that you don't have to get involved in it. I think that there may be those extenuating circumstances, but what you have to keep in mind is that if that has indeed showed up in their background, do you want to take that risk? Do you want to be given the assurance by the individual themselves saying yes, I did have a problem with that in the past, but I can assure you that that's not going to happen again? Because sometimes these people are repeat offenders. Sometimes this is a very serious problem. And unless it's been chronicled that they've had very serious professional counseling, and you know for a fact that this has completely been removed from their lives, then you might want to consider them. But I would take into consideration the counsel of other wise individuals within church leadership. I mean, that's a big step. That's a big risk you're taking. And ultimately, it may come back to haunt you. Ultimately, it may come back to haunt you.
I was also thinking, considering the parents of the youth. I mean, I may say, oh,
Yes.
the blood, it's okay, but then you have parents.
That's right.
That doesn't feel the same way.
That's right.
So we want to consider.
That's right. And that's a great point. That's a great bit of insight. You know, what about you're okay with it, and even you really have peace with God about making the decision to have them work in the youth ministry, and then the parents find out that this kind of criminal behavior or abuse was found in their background, and you know, as far as they're concerned, they don't know what your consideration was. They don't know your thoughts about it. They just think that you turned your back on it, that you just you winked at it. It was no big deal. So obviously, that's a good point, something to take into consideration as well. Yes. That would be a question for somebody within our ministry, like Pastor Peter Taggart, who is in charge and has responsibility for those kinds of issues. But if you have any concerns about it, then you should definitely seek out those individuals, because you don't want to, I mean, it should be something that's established within the government of any local assembly. But if you have not established that church government yet, then you should come under the church government of another local assembly and then have them submit to the policies that are required by that local assembly. So I would highly recommend it. I mean, you just don't want to put anybody in close proximity to children that you don't know. It's that simple. I mean, you know, I can in good conscience go into youth ministry work and know that nothing like that has been a part of my life, has been a part of my past. And I think if it were, that would warrant the suspicion of a parent or anyone who knew about it. I mean, I'd have to just face that reality. That would be a concern that they would have, and I would have to accept that. And if it prevents me from working with young people, then, you know, so be it. Does that mean that God has disqualified me for the rest of my life? No. No. It may mean that I will not be able to minister to young people. That's what it may mean. It may be that my ministry will be in another capacity within the Church of Jesus Christ, just not young people. We, years ago we had a situation where, we had a young person, three young men who felt uncomfortable with a counselor. And when I did the background check and I did the research and I talked to these young people and I talked to their parents and I got all the facts together, well, then he stood before a church official, myself and a church official, and he was very repentant and he was very sorry and he promised not to do it again. And then the church official looked at me and said, is that, he's promised not to do it. I said, to this church official, I said, he will never do it again because he will never have the opportunity to do it again. It wasn't going to be, I'm sorry. No, sorry, that's just me. That's under my watch. No, no, no. It's just a rock-hard, crystallized conviction. And I'm sorry to have to tell you that person was convicted of sexual abuse within 2 years. Very sorry to have to tell you that. Very sorry for the young person that was the victim. I remember that church official came to me and said, my gosh, I can't believe that that's happened. I said, I can believe it because of the circumstances involving the previous case where three young boys they felt uncomfortable. That's enough for me. You see, if you're working with young people, there's no reason why children or young boys or girls should be uncomfortable. If they are, why are they uncomfortable? It warrants somewhat of an investigation on the part of those who place those people in authority and working in close proximity to children. I mean, this is just, it's sad to think that we have to be talking about this in the class, but it's absolutely necessary in the light of the day, in the age, and the times in which we live. Right? I mean, I got to be honest with you. We weren't thinking this way 25 years ago in youth ministry. We weren't thinking this way 20 years ago. Maybe we should have been. Maybe we should have been. But now, it's very clear to anyone involved in any capacity of ministry that you must take and make every precaution to make sure that sexual predators do not find their way into your youth ministry or Sunday school or Christian school or child care program, whatever the case might be. Written application these days can go a long way to helping protecting children, saving them. All right? Secondly, here's the second thing that you need to do, and a good step that's to be taken to protect these young people. Interview every volunteer personally. And listen, don't be afraid to come outright and ask the question. What's the question? Have you ever abused or molested a child or a young person? I know it sounds, the idea of confronting a person with such a question sounds almost, horrifying. But you got to ask the question. You got to ask that question. And then it's on you to kind of keep your eyes open and your spiritual senses sharp to perceive if there's any hints of deception. If you get anything like, well, what do you mean? Do I have to make that any more clear? My question was simply, have you ever abused or molested a child or a young person? That's a pretty, that's either yes or no. And you personally, you know what the answer is that I like? I like to hear this kind of an answer. No, and I would do bodily harm to anyone who did. Then I would say, I'd like to have you work with us. That sounds good. I'm just kidding. I don't mean that. We don't hire hitmen in the youth ministry. But that's, I'd rather have that. I'd rather have somebody become angry just over the thought or the idea of harming young children. I mean, to me, it's just, oh my gosh, it makes my blood boil. I'm sure it does yours, and rightly so. So interview every person, and then you can, everybody. We all have this capacity, hopefully, a measure of discernment that helps us to read people a little bit. I'm not talking about judging people. Okay. That's not what I'm talking about. We don't judge people. And the reason why is because you judge somebody, you're going to be judged yourself. That's not the point. But we should be discerning people. Okay? I was troubled once years ago in a church where, that you had these new people. They said, I want to help in any way I can. I just want to serve. And somebody said, oh, well, you're available. You come with me. I want you to greet people at the door. Well, this guy kind of lit up. He's like, yeah, well, I noticed that he wasn't greeting anybody but the ladies. And he was greeting them with a big old hug and a big old kiss. And, you could tell some of these ladies were very uncomfortable. They did not really appreciate it. And I didn't appreciate it because as far as I'm concerned, this person is a perfect stranger. We don't even know who he is. Is that what you want to do? You want to make him the person that, welcomes everybody into the church? Who is he? Oh, I can't remember his name, but he really wanted to do it. That's my next point. Avoid using new people to the church. See, the thing about some of these abusers, they move from place to place, and they hope that their reputation will not catch up with them. So, I would say you got new people coming to the church, let them come to the church, let them get settled into the church, let them get grounded into the fellowship, and you watch out for those that isolate themselves from the body of Christ. You watch out for those who don't want to get too close to anybody lest they discern something about them that isn't quite right. New people, you don't give any responsibility to. You just say, hey, you new to the church, come in, hear the word of God, get built up, worship God, get to know people, minister. Forget about ministry right now. That will come in time. You just get built up and get grounded, get settled here in the church. Take several months, take a year. Maybe God will lead you, and then that will be fine. And then, then you might want to even ask other people. It's not wrong for you to look to other volunteers within your youth ministry. Say, how do you think so-and-so is working out? I mean, you've observed them now for a number of weeks or months. Well, what are your impressions? What are your impressions of this person? Because somebody might come to you, and this has happened to me, and probably it's happened to you too. You occupy a position of leadership, and somebody within your jurisdiction, spiritually speaking, comes to you and says, listen, could I talk to you? I have some concerns about so-and-so. All right? And then you can give them, you've got to give them, an opportunity to air those concerns, because they may be very legitimate concerns. It could be that you are so busy or not overseeing the direct care of what those volunteers are doing, and you might not pick it up, you might not see it, you might not be in a place to be able to see it, but they may be in a better place to see it, and you're watching, and they're coming to you, and they're saying, listen, I have some concern. You listen to those concerns. If that young youth leader listened to me when I made that phone call, we might not have had more abuse in another state. But he didn't think it was necessary. It was a tragic mistake. I mean, if somebody calls me and they say, listen, this is the antithesis of the previous illustration that I gave you. Somebody calls and says, listen, I'm sending some Bible college students from our ministry, and this one, he worked great with young people. He's highly recommended. Well, what if another leader calls and says, listen, if this person comes and he says, I want to work with young people, don't let him. Okay, that's a red flag that goes up. I'm going to watch that. I'm going to look. I'm going to see. And if he tries to, we're going to, maybe you got to call other people and have other people involved in it, maybe in the company of one or two other witnesses, but we're going to say, no, I don't think that this is the right place for you. And maybe we can leave it right there, but if you want us to do a more thorough investigation, or if you feel as though these charges are unwarranted or false, then we'll see them through with you. We will conduct a more thorough investigation. But I think sometimes if people know that they've had problems in these areas, they don't want a more thorough investigation. They understand. They start to get the picture that maybe working with young people is not going to be for me. So you have every right to look to the volunteers that are working with you, that you trust, and seeking out their advice and their recommendations. And then here's the next thing you can do, and this is important too. You keep networking with other youth ministers. Keep networking with other youth ministers, especially when it comes to problems relating to abuse, okay? Because as I said, sometimes these abusers, they just bounce from church to church, from youth ministry to youth ministry. It's not that unusual. And by the way, this might involve contacting social workers and educators. Their insights may be helpful to you in making an all-important decision as to whether or not a certain individual is going to be used in youth ministry work under your supervision. Okay? Could be the school system. They could be of some help. Could be a guidance counselor. He could be of some help. Again, educators, social workers. They may be able to give you some real good guidelines that would help you to determine what kind of a person you may be looking for, or the kind of a person that you might want to avoid. And then the last one is this. And this is so practical. This just makes sense. Avoid letting volunteers be alone with young people. That's just practical, isn't it? It's just practical. I mean, sure, on the one hand, you want young people to open up and to share with those that are working with them, and to really open up and share with the youth leaders and the volunteers through personal conversation and through some form of personal contact. But the point is, try to make sure that that can happen in the context of a group. Okay? It's better to have 2 or 3 individuals there, because God forbid, what if, your intentions are as pure as the driven snow, but you are alone with a young person? Okay? Now, we know that this happens. We've heard of these stories where a young person, maybe there was abuse going on in the home, but then they transfer it to somebody else that they trust. In your case, it might be you as the youth worker. And out of nowhere, you are shocked and just, overwhelmed with disbelief at the fact that that young person has accused you of some kind of sexual abuse. And you say, that's absurd. Well, why would they do that? And then you start to discuss it. Well, when did this happen? Well, he said it happened when you gave them a ride home the other night. Did you give them a ride home? Well, yes, I did. Was there anyone else in the vehicle? No, there wasn't. Well, that's when they said it happened. Now, obviously, and you hear that, you think to yourself, well, you know what? I'm not going to let myself be in that kind of a situation. And that's a good way to think. Now, I understand. I understand. There may be those times where you say, look, I'm the only ride home, okay? I am the only way this person's going to get home. And if I don't give him a ride, he's going to walk home. And who knows what's going to happen. They end up, a lot worse off than ended up having me drive him home. So I got to do it. Well, again, if it's someone of the opposite sex, they sit in the back seat. That's not a problem. If it's a young man, you have them call their parents, say, Mom, Dad, we're in the car right now. We're on our way. This is how many minutes away we are, and we'll be there soon. I mean, there are precautions that you can take, but ideally, you don't want to be alone with young people because those accusations could be drawn against you. So, again, you say, well, how am I ever going to get them to open up? How am I ever going to get them to talk? How am I ever going to find out what troubles them or what kind of issues that they're dealing with in life if we don't have some personal time, some one-on-one investment? Well, again, you got to find ways to do that. It could be, again, in a church setting, in an open area. It could be, you sit down. Let me use this as the illustration, the cafe. But, okay, so you're in one of the booths over there. Come on. That's right here, open. There's people in that cafe. Nothing like that's going to happen. If that's where your conversation takes place, and if that's where later a young person accuses you of abusing them, supposedly had taken place, and they say this is what time it was, well, you can say that cafe was filled with people. There was people looking. We were there. Please don't be ridiculous. And there'll never be any witnesses, and there'll never be any evidence to corroborate that young person's story. It just makes sense. It's kind of like, a married man doesn't want to be driving around with a single woman, right? Because that is what? That's just the appearance. It's just the appearance. It may be perfectly innocent. There may be absolutely nothing wrong with those two individuals. And yet somebody sees it and they think, oh my gosh, what is going on there? That's Pastor so-and-so. And he's with that girl. What's that all about? He's married, and it's just lends to the idea, and it's just, the suggestion, the thought, the appearance of evil. So you just don't even want to go there. So just encourage them to do those kinds of things. I'm talking about your youth leaders in more public settings, in public locations, right? Right out in the open. Yes, have the group, you go with the group and they're going out maybe to get some ice cream after the Bible study, but you go over in a table and you're talking to that someone because they said, listen, I really need to talk to you. Fine, not a problem. But I'm not going to come to your house. I'm not going to pick you up. We're not going to go to a restaurant and then go in the back of the restaurant where it's very dark and talk. Not a wise thing to do. You're going to do it out in the open, and there's going to be plenty of people around, and you can still, again, have that ministry and give them the opportunity to bare their hearts and to tell you what's troubling them or what's working with them. I think this kind of works both ways in the sense that you're protecting the young person or child, but you're also protecting the youth leader from accusation. There's really two parties here that you're protecting. The young person, to be sure, that's your priority, but also the youth leader, because we know that youth leaders have been falsely accused. Youth pastors have been pastors have been falsely accused. In some cases, their reputations have been ruined on the basis of mere accusation, when there was no evidence and no proof, and usually in some instances like that, when nothing happened, the people will come out years later and say, no, nothing did happen. Well, this is only after the fact that the man lost his pastorate, he lost his family, he lost his reputation in the community, and he was ruined as a result of it. So there's two parties here that we're talking about protecting. The young person, absolutely, but also the youth leader. You don't want them subject to these kinds of accusations, okay? Any questions about this? Because this, unfortunately, we even have to, as I said for the third time, that we even have to address it. It's painful to have to talk about it, to have to think that the possibility of something like this could even happen. But in the day, the age, and the time in which we find ourselves living, church in the 21st century, it happens. It happens. Yes, Pastor Javi. Can I give you the microphone? Because It's quite possible that what we're sharing could be very helpful to some of the folks that are taking the class on video.
I have a question regarding, do we have guidelines of like Greater Grace youth pastors or youth workers conduct that would be spread, say, through the branch churches, so that they would learn more about this and act accordingly?
Good question. I believe that the written application may not be so much a list of policies and procedures for the youth leader, but they clearly are contained and they are clearly evident in the nature of the questions found in the examination, found in the application. So, although they are not written out specifically in terms of conduct and behavior and qualifications, it's suggested by the nature of some of the questions that are asked. In other words, you can't miss it, but I think it does make sense that we could include with the application a list of policies and procedures that would help to identify what it is that we're looking for in a possible volunteer or somebody that is looking to have a ministry to young people. So that's a good thought, something that I can look into as I take a look at the application. But it's clearly contained in the questions themselves. Obviously, the questions themselves reveal the qualities and the characteristics that we hope to find in our youth leaders, and we certainly, by those same questions and qualifications, we hope that we don't find certain things. And if we do, depending upon their answers, there may be enough there that would lead us to believe that it's not a good fit. It's not a good fit. See, the worst thing that we could do is to have someone who has been guilty, found guilty in a court of law, in child abuse, and then without taking the necessary precautions, we swing the door wide open because we're so desperate. You see, a lot of churches are desperate for volunteers, especially in the realm of youth ministry work, you know? Sometimes in some local churches, it's like the only qualification is necessary is a car or a van. You got a car, you got a van, you are in. You know, they come and they say, what do I have, what qualifications? And they say, how did you get here? I drove. Oh, you're qualified. You have a car, you have a van, that means you can pick up kids and you can take them home. That's all you need. But, maybe, from a humorous point of view, that, we used to think that way. Not anymore. Not anymore. Somebody would come to me in all honesty and transparency. Hey, I'm new to the church. It's a young man. He's 25, 26. I'm new to the church, and I just want to work with young people. And somebody directed me to you. Are you Pastor Love? Yes, I am. Hey, when do you meet? I'm ready to go. I might think to myself, oh, thank God. It's an answer to prayer. Been praying for more help, more volunteers, more people that will be available on the weekends. And then you say, when are you available? You available on weekends? Yes, that's when I'm oh my God, this is great. But now it's like, okay, the first thought that comes to my mind now is that you have to fill out an application. I don't know who you are. Where'd you move? I came from Minnesota and I just moved here. Well, that's great, but we need to know who you are, and we need a little bit more background. We need to do, a criminal background check. I know you're not a criminal. I trust you're not, but we got to do that anyhow. It's the law, and we're going to abide by these applications. And then after the application is submitted, and after it's all been checked out, and you get a clean bill of health from any kind of criminal background, then we can sit down and talk. But to be honest with you, as we talked about tonight, I'd like you to kind of get settled in the church. I'd like you to find your place here in the church. I'd like you, if you're here to go to Bible college, why don't you take a few classes? Why don't you get a semester under your belt? And if you still feel enthusiastic and thrilled and chomping at the bit that you want, then you come and see me and then we'll talk. It's the best way to do it. It's the safest way to do it for the sake of the young people that we're talking about. All right? Yes, I want to give you the microphone, okay? Everybody gets the microphone.
And what if a woman youth leader, like, is it the same? Like, can a woman youth leader take out a girl just by herself, or?
I think the same principles apply to both men and women. I think it's just safe. Yeah, I know that I think the common idea behind this is most people who commit sexual crimes against children, they're usually males. That isn't always the case. That isn't always the case. And so we can't be too cautious when it comes, because you got to remember something, If you're talking about a young person, a young guy is 20 years old, and somebody, tries to do something harmful to him, well, the point is that he could defend himself, right? I mean, he might, a person comes in, he says, you take another step, I'm going to punch you in the nose. I'm going to take this club right here, I'm going to hit you over the head. If he senses that person is approaching him with some perverted motives. Young people don't have that option. They are innocent. They are the most vulnerable in our society. And that's why the responsibility to protect them falls upon us. You see? I mean, I think this way. When we have a camp program, and you have, in the past, we've had as many as 400 to 500 young people over the course of 2 weeks' time. And I'm thinking in my mind, nobody better harm these children. Nobody better touch them inappropriately. Nobody better make them feel uncomfortable. This is supposed to be, you hear kids talk about their camp experiences, and they talk about how wonderful it was and how amazing it was, and I have the best memories, and I remember my counselor when I was in the second grade, and I remember the good time we had, and I remember those meetings, and I remember all the fun. You don't want that to be absolutely ruined by a young person who says, I had someone molest me at a camp. You see, that to me is like my worst nightmare. I would feel responsible for that. Ultimately, I would feel responsible for that. I didn't do it. I would never tolerate it. If I found out it was happening, I would immediately respond and probably react. But ultimately, people would say, it's your camp. Your name's on that brochure. You're the director. You cleared that person to come. And on more than a few occasions, we've had to tell camp counselors, thank you so much for being here for these couple of days, but it's not a good fit. We're going to have to ask you to leave. Maybe they're just too reactionary. Maybe they look at camp as if it's, they thought it was Camp Life military camp, and they're expecting that these little children are little soldiers. Well, they're not little soldiers. They're just little campers. They're not in the Marine Corps, right? They're not in the Navy, and they're not in the armed forces. So that, you can't function like a drill sergeant. You have to function like a caring, loving, investing camp counselor. And if you're not, we could realize that might not have been our best decision this week. We have to find a way to, what's the word? Diffuse that camp counselor situation. Maybe take that person out. Sometimes it works because we take them out of a highly charged cabin with 15 campers. I mean, the problem sometimes is a counselor comes and they love it, they love kids and everything, but after 1, 2, 3 nights, no sleep, 15 kids, crazy kids. I mean, I've walked into some of those cabins at night and I think to myself, how can you do this? I could never do this. I mean, they're running around, they're crazy, they're bouncing off the walls, the ceilings. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning and the camp counselors are like, ugh. So, I mean, it's, I don't know how they do it. I think it's just incredible. But sometimes they need, they might need a break. So you got to give them that break, get them out of that cabin for a little while, give them they sometimes go somewhere and maybe fall asleep for a few hours, get some rest and come back, maybe be refreshed. I mean, there's a lot that you can factor in there. But really, bottom line is your overall objective is to protect those young people and to provide for them the most enjoyable, the most pleasant experience that they can have together with all of those young people and make awesome memories. I'm thrilled to this day. Sometimes we go downtown, we evangelize, and one time I ran into a young man, and we were giving out gospel tracts, and he goes, "Hey, you're Pastor Love." I said, "Yes." And he said, you remember me?" And I was like, "No." He's I don't know, he's like 27, 28 years old. He goes, "I was at camp when I was 9 years old." And I was like, "You're kidding." He says, "No." He says, "Best time of my life." And I'm like, that is great. That's what you want to hear. That's what you want to hear. And I don't remember them, honestly. I mean, they grow up, and some of them came because they were in the city, and somebody sponsored them to come, and there was a ministry to people in that neighborhood, and they came, and we really didn't know them all that well. And then they moved on afterwards, and we lost contact with them, but it's pretty good when they come up to you and say, "Man, I love that. That was the best week of my life." You just say, "That's it, Lord. That's why we want to do the things that we want to do." And then you have young people that are involved in youth ministries, and they are invested in, they're loved, they're cared for, they really are giving something of Christ, something of a substantial nature from God, and they carry that with them for the rest of their lives. That's what makes it worthwhile. That's why we want to make sure that as we're choosing and selecting volunteers, we go through the process, however lengthy and tedious it may be, but we do it because we just want to provide for them the best possible care we can. Yes, let me give you the microphone.
You might have already said this, but the background check process, did you say that was required by law, or is that just a best practice?
I think it's the best practice. I'm not sure if it's necessarily required by law. It may be in some educational institutions, if they're state-run or state-funded. I'm not so sure about privately run corporations, whether they are churches or tax-exempt organizations. I'm not sure. So I think the responsibility falls on the organization itself to make sure that those applications are filled out and the process is funded.
It is required by law here.
In the state of Maryland?
Yeah, in my church, it's required. Anyone who's going to be involved with children.
There you go. And that's you know what I say to that? That's a good law. That's a good law. Because if some churches, they might consider it too carnal to do such a thing, As I mentioned earlier, sometimes people can look at it and say, like, well, I don't want to know anybody after the flesh. Well, I don't either. But I want to protect the children. And if the law steps in and does that for us as organizations, whether we are a charitable organization or a church organization or an educational institution, I think it serves a great, great purpose. I think that that's when the civil laws actually help the church and protect children. Again, the most innocent in our society. All right, yes, one more. I got to give you the mic, though, if you don't mind. I'm sorry. All these questions are so good that we don't want the, which means you got to come and get it, yeah. These are good questions. We don't want anybody to miss out on any of these questions that are taking the video class.
I just had a question. Say in one case, you had a youth worker who's been very faithful in years and years, and then it comes up where a youth comes and tells you something happened between the two of us. Like, how do you decide, which one to believe? Like, say the youth worker comes and says, I don't know what you're talking about, but the youth is just like, adamant about it happening. What would you do in that situation?
Okay, good question. That's a great question. It falls upon the youth leader, the administrator, or the pastor, whatever the case might be, to conduct a thorough investigation. If those kinds of allegations and charges are going to be made. Again, remember, you have the child that you must be concerned about, whose responsibility you have to protect. You also have the reputation of the youth leader. If, in fact, these charges are false, if they're just mere allegations, plenty of allegations and no alligators, then you got to say, wait a minute, something's terribly wrong here. You can't get anybody to corroborate the story. I mean, it can be difficult. Sometimes unfortunately, these situations find themselves in, the unjust magistrate's courtroom, right? That's where they can end up if they cannot be resolved at a church level or an organizational level. So they're very serious, and the only thing you can do is to persist in trying to carry out a thorough investigation, which may mean involving civil authorities and other parties that otherwise you might not want to involve, but you may not be given any choice. If it comes down to somebody's making an accusation, the other one is denying it, you can look at the biblical precedent, and that is, according to the book of Deuteronomy, you have to have 2 witnesses to substantiate and to corroborate an accusation against someone. Now, you would ideally want that and need that, but sometimes, as you mentioned, Grant, in that situation, the young person swears it happens, and the volunteer, the youth leader, whatever the case might be, says, no, it did not happen, I'm telling you. I think you have to factor in the young person's background, the young person's family history, and all of this may require tedious investigation. I mean, like with a fine-tooth comb, you just got to go through it and I got to find out what's happened in the past. Have these allegations and accusations arisen in other churches or in other institutions, in school? And were they found, the persons that were charged with the accusation, were they found guiltless and there was nothing to them? Then you think, well, maybe there's a pattern there. Then you have to check the other side. You have to do, you got to find out people that know that youth leader, based upon your observations of this person, whether you live with them in the apartment building, you work beside them at the workplace, you know them from growing up. What happens? You go back and you look at their records in school and you find out that they did have a history of some kind of perversion, although they were never found guilty in a court of law. Then you start to think it could have happened. So again, I'm sorry to say that nothing short of a thorough and complete investigation to the satisfaction of you, perhaps the authorities, and perhaps other church leadership will do. Yes, Jeff. Microphone. We'll take this last question and then we'll take a break.
How would you handle if a child came from the church accusing someone not in the church, like a parent or another adult, but they came to you and wondered, how would you handle that?
Again, with wisdom, but you cannot turn your back. For instance, when this father came to me in tears saying that his son had done this, we couldn't just simply take his word. We had to do some investigating, and as we did a thorough investigation, we came to find out that not only what the father had suggested had happened, but even worse. Even worse. So, this didn't happen within, it happened within the church family, if you will. It didn't happen within the school or the youth ministry, but it was of such great concern to us that if it happened there once, it could happen again in some other places. We had to act, we had to move, but we had to conduct an investigation quietly, but thoroughly, and we had to seek it out. So I think it's on us. It is on us that we have to help young people. It could be their way. It could be their way of reaching out to the only person that they honestly trust and believe can help them. And if that's you, that means a lot. And I remember, and I don't know if I shared this with you earlier, but if I did, I beg your pardon, but there was a former Miss America. She was crowned Miss America in this country several years ago, and it came out, she came out, and she said publicly that she had been sexually molested by a family member. And now listen to this. And they said, well, did you ever tell anyone? She said, yes, I told my youth pastor. And he came forward years later, after retired, he had been retired for years, he came out and he said, yes, she did. This happened, and I can tell you all of the facts, and what he said that she said actually happened. He corroborated it. It really did happen, and she was able to not only deal with it, but to move on with her life and to isolate it, put it behind her, and she went on to live a very, very profitable life. And this was Miss America. Okay? So this is somebody in the public eye. This is somebody that everybody looked as she walked down that runway and say, oh my goodness, she's so beautiful, she's so lovely, she's Miss America. And nobody knew that she had been sexually molested except for one person that she felt she could trust, and that was her youth pastor. How about that? And it could be that you may be the only person that people will trust. It could be that you're the person that they feel comfortable enough to confide in and to say, listen, I have to tell you what happened to me because I just can't get over it, and I don't know what to do. And I cannot tell a family member because, they're going to disbelieve, they're going to discredit me, they're going to threaten me, whatever. But I know I can tell you. Why? Because you're that person in his or her life that tells the truth. You're always talking about the truth. You're communicating the truth. You're preaching the truth. You're conveying the truth. You're living the truth. And they can trust you with the truth. All right. Let's take a break. We'll come back here at 8:15 and we'll finish up the class tonight.